In the previous video, the second video in this series, we looked at Luke's reckoning of the reign of Tiberius, and drawing upon the arguments from the first video in this series, we showed that the crucifixion of Jesus took place on April 3rd, AD 33. In this video, we're going to set aside our arguments about how Luke reckoned Tiberius's reign, and we're going to make an independent argument, also drawing upon the conclusions from the first video in this series, and we will show that it comes to exactly the same conclusion. In this video, we're going to look at the relationship between the Roman official Sejanus, Pontius Pilate, and the trial of Jesus. Sejanus was a very powerful Roman official and the head of the Praetorian Guard. Under Tiberius, he was for a time the second most powerful man in Rome. Indeed, it would be fair to say that for at least a few years of Tiberius's reign, Sejanus was essentially running the empire, while Tiberius, of his own free will, was sequestered away on an island. I'll be drawing heavily upon the work of Paul Maier, Emeritus Professor of Ancient History at Western Michigan University. I'd like to point out two data points he draws attention to. Number one, it was almost certainly at the appointment of Sejanus that Pontius Pilate got the top job in Judea in the first place. And number two, Sejanus would have served as something of a protector and or ally to Pilate. Philo tells us that Sejanus brought significant anti-Semitic feeling to Rome. Sejanus was not kind to the Jews, and his influence would have protected Pilate, whom Luke and Josephus tell us also was unkind to the Jews. He was willing to desecrate their sacred places and do terrible things to them. Pilate could get away with these things. He could get away with murder, literally, while Sejanus was in power. He didn't need to worry about consequences for being brutal to the Jews. Then Pilate's world got turned upside down. A plot was discovered against Tiberius, and who should be found at the center of it but Sejanus himself? So what does Tiberius do? Well, like any good Caesar, he has Sejanus executed. He has the other conspirators executed. He has people who might have been conspirators executed. And of course, he investigates friends, family, and allies of the conspirators to see if there's anybody else he ought to execute as well. This leaves Pilate in a bad position. He really does not want to draw attention to himself. This is a good time to say, move right along, nothing to see here in Judea, everything is fine. Well, everything was not entirely fine for Pilate. He stepped in it. He brought golden shields dedicated to Tiberius into Jerusalem and put them in the palace of Herod. The Jews were furious. They saw this as a desecration of their holy city. Herod Antipas himself and his brothers emphatically opposed Pilate's actions. A delegation was sent to Rome, and Tiberius sent back a nasty letter essentially telling Pilate, "You fool, get those shields out of there." Pilate's not exactly doing himself any favors here. Now, we do not know exactly when the shields incident occurred. I've seen estimates varying from AD 26 to AD 32. One point that Paul Maier makes is that if Sejanus is in power, Pilate's not likely to get this nasty letter. This is likely to be after the death of Sejanus, because when Sejanus is receiving all the correspondence and controlling Tiberius's mail, Pilate could probably get away with something like this. So this suggests it's probably on the later end. In any event, Pilate is in hot water. He hasn't done himself any favors with Rome, and he no longer has his powerful ally, Sejanus, to protect him. This brings us now to the trial of Jesus. The Gospels record that Pilate did not want to execute Jesus. He tried at least 4 times, possibly more, to have Jesus acquitted, but the Sanhedrin wouldn't hear it. Now, I'm deliberately being very precise here. I'm not talking about all Jews at the time, and certainly not all Jews in general. I'm talking about a very specific group of people, the Sanhedrin, in a very specific time and place. The Sanhedrin, or at least some members thereof, conspired to have Jesus executed by the Romans. Pilate did not want to go along, and he parried their every argument. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. Then the Sanhedrin played their trump card, as recorded in the Gospel of John. Now, it's worth pointing out that a number of historians have observed that the Gospel of John shows tremendous familiarity not only with the details of Jesus' trial, but the cultural context in which it happened, suggesting we're looking at really good eyewitness testimony here. The Gospel of John records what it was that pushed Pilate over the edge. After a lot of back and forth, the Sanhedrin finally said, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." This was no veiled or vague threat. Pilate knew exactly what they meant. They were making a direct threat of an appeal to Rome. They were telling him, if you don't do like we say and execute this man, we will spill the beans on you. We'll let Rome know all the nasty things you've been doing, and Tiberius will fire you. And by the way, if you get fired by Tiberius, especially when Tiberius is in a bad mood, don't bank on a really nice severance package. The Sanhedrin is making a significant threat against Pilate, and the fact that he backed down shows that the threat was credible. Pilate had painted himself into a corner through his violent past, and now he was paying for it. He was blackmailed, and he gave in. He ordered the execution of Jesus to avoid the complaint being sent to Rome. What does this have to do with Sejanus? Well, during the lifetime of Sejanus, this threat by the Sanhedrin had no force. Pilate didn't need to worry about what would happen to him if a complaint was sent to Rome. Sejanus was receiving Tiberius's mail and controlling it. Tiberius wasn't going to even know. Sejanus wouldn't get Pilate in trouble for this. But after Sejanus is gone, Pilate does need to toe the line. He can't afford another slip-up. He can't afford a report to Rome. He no longer has Sejanus there to protect him. This is where the chronology brings this argument to a conclusion. The conspiracy of Sejanus was discovered, and Sejanus was executed in the fall of AD 31. This means that because the Sanhedrin's argument would not work before Sejanus' death, we're talking about sometime after he died. Since Jesus died at Passover, that means the earliest date, could be later, can't be earlier, the earliest date of the crucifixion would be the spring of AD 32. Well, we showed in the previous video there were 3 dates consistent with all of the evidence we've considered. We've now shown both in the second video and through our argument about Sejanus that AD 27 doesn't work. Sejanus is still alive. AD 30 doesn't work for the same reason. Once again, AD 33 is the last man standing. That the Sanhedrin's argument was credible and that it worked is manifest by the fact that Pilate backed down. This only works after Sejanus is dead. This gives us, again, a reasonable conclusion. The crucifixion occurred in AD 33. I'd like to look now briefly at 3 other data points. I don't think they are nearly so decisive. I'm not using them as foundational premises for my argument, but they are interesting. 1, the Talmud appears to suggest that the Sanhedrin lost the power to perform capital punishment 40 years before the destruction of the temple. The Gospels are clear that the Sanhedrin at the time did not have the power to execute someone. They had to go to Rome to get permission. They had to have Pilate approve the execution of Jesus. Well, we don't know how precisely to take this statement in the Talmud, but the temple was destroyed in the summer of AD 70. If we go back 40 years, before that time they could perform capital punishment. After that time they couldn't. Only one of these dates is less than 40 years from the destruction of the temple. Again, that's AD 33. Additionally, we have early sources that tell us that there was an eclipse and an earthquake at the time of Jesus' death. Well, astronomically, we can calculate when an eclipse occurred and from where it was visible. And there was, in fact, a lunar eclipse visible from Judea on April 3rd, AD 33. And finally, the earthquake. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that there was an earthquake at the time of Jesus' death. We know from geology that there was a major earthquake in this region around this time. We aren't able to pinpoint the date of the earthquake with precision, but it is interesting to note that not only do we know from geology there was an earthquake, but the historian Phlegon also tells us of a major earthquake that took place in AD 33. Thus, while none of these last 3 data points are decisive, they are interesting corroborating evidence for a conclusion that we reached on separate and more solid grounds. With AD 33, we're remarkably consistent with the evidence. We have not had to appeal to hypotheticals, and we have not had to throw out any of our early sources because we couldn't explain them. If in the major arguments in this series we have correctly interpreted the historical data, and I suggest that we have, then we can reasonably conclude that the crucifixion of Jesus took place on the date known to the Jews as the 14th of Nisan, known to the Romans as the 3rd of April, in the year we know as AD 33.